you everyone for joining this webinar hosted by the Innovation Policy Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I'm Dan Bresnitz, the Munk Chair of Innovation Studies and the co-director of the Munk School of Innovation Policy Lab and co-director of CIFR's program on innovation, equity, and the future of prosperity. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Today, we're going to talk about policymaking under uncertainty. This is a big issue and a very relevant issue, and we have only 1 hour, so we'll go right into it. We are inviting questions from the audience, and please, as you can see in this slide, use the Zoom question and answer field to submit your question for the panelists, and I will filter them through. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in our 1 hour. Our panelists today are Uri Gabai, who is the co-general manager of Startups Nation Central in Tel Aviv, and was also the former chief strategy officer at the Israeli Innovation Authority, and before that, the office of the chief scientist. Darius Ornston is an associate professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and a member of the Innovation Policy Lab. Sylvia Schwaag Serger is Lund University Deputy Vice Chancellor and Professor of Research Policy at the School of Economics and Management. She also serves as a member of the Swedish Prime Minister's Innovation Council, and she also was a former director for international strategy at Innova, the Swedish agency of innovation, for about 10 years, if I remember correctly. Without further ado, we should start. Sylvia, each panelist have 5 to 7 minutes to start the panel, with Sylvia going first. Sylvia,
Thank you Thanks a lot, Dan. I'm just going to start so I don't start my timer so I don't exceed my 5 minutes. It's great to be in this context with you virtually and to discuss this topic, which I find extremely interesting. So I've spent like 20 years trying to understand how countries work with innovation policies, both from designing policy, but also evaluating and researching on it. And on this topic of science and technology and innovation policy under uncertainty, under conditions of uncertainty, I would like to point out that I think we're dealing with 3 dimensions of uncertainty when it comes to policymaking right now, in particular with respect to innovation policy. So the first one is that actually the very nature of innovation policy is changing very quickly, especially in the European countries and in the Nordic countries, which I focus on a lot. You know, for many years, for like 20 years, innovation policy was about sort of driving incremental change and generically promoting commercialization of research. But in the last 10 years, roughly, Nordic governments and agencies have realized that that might not be enough, and that if we're going to deal with the challenges that we're facing in society today, like climate change, like growing inequalities, like an aging population, we need to sort of target certain problems and try to direct innovation and transformative change towards these problems. And so the first dimension of uncertainty is that we're dealing now with an environment and with a demand on policymaking that we should be able, through science and technology and innovation policy, to address these challenges that society is facing and move society towards transformative change in these areas. The second dimension of uncertainty is something that's also been happening in the last 5 to 10 years, which is that the context within which we do policy, particularly science and technology policy, is changing. So you have, for example, the increasing protectionism, nationalism, isolationism that we're witnessing in large parts of the world, not least, for example, the current tendencies in the US, but also in China. You also have other policy areas, for example, environmental policy, social policy, that are increasingly trying to put pressure on science and technology policy, precisely for the reasons I mentioned before, that, you know, what are you doing to help us solve our looming problems, for example, with pollution or climate change. And then you also have a rapid technological development, which is really creating a lot of uncertainty because we don't really know how these technologies are going to be used and applied and how they're going to develop. So you have these other areas of uncertainty that are playing into science and technology policy, which are in essence increasing the complexity of science and technology policymaking. And then finally, the third dimension of uncertainty that we're dealing with, of course, is the current pandemic and its ramifications. So on top of the first two dimensions of uncertainty, we now have this crisis and pandemic, the consequences of which we're not totally sure yet how they will play out. But what's fairly likely is that it will lead to long-term disruption, potentially drawn-out economic crises, and potentially social upheaval, potentially destabilizing our democracies or mature democracies. So my first point is that we have these three dimensions of uncertainty, and COVID is only the third dimension, so it's now interacting with the other two dimensions, creating perhaps some exponential uncertainty and instability. So then the next point becomes, you know, what does that mean then for science and technology policymaking? And what are the ramifications, or for policymaking in general? And I think it's sort of this unique confluence of underlying problems that we're dealing with, challenges that I've mentioned, a sense of crisis highlighted obviously by COVID right now, and this complexity. So these three things are sort of combining to put new pressures, but also lasting pressures on policymaking. And in essence, what it means for countries, and that becomes very clear in the Nordic countries, is that you're dealing with institutions such as public sector, but also academia, that have been very good at perhaps you know, running policy in times of relative stability, but that are now struggling in dealing with these new demands that are put on policymaking. And what COVID, I think, is doing is, and its ramifications, is that it's both creating an opportunity but also a challenge. And the opportunity is that it's actually highlighting that we need to do things radically differently if we're going to be able to handle our problems. So that, in essence, this crisis has sort of propelled a sense of urgency and has created a consensus, which I can see in governments and across Europe, that we need to do something radically different if we're going to handle our problems. So that's a good thing, because I think there are a lot of things we need to change fundamentally. The negative side is that actually public agencies and higher education institutions are very dependent on public funding. And they're, of course, concerned right now what's going to happen to them and their budgets in the coming maybe 5 to 10 years or 5 years. You know, if they're going to continue to receive funding, for example, from the government, when the government is dealing with a ton of other crises. And so that, I think, risks actually making policy making more risk adverse. So you have on the one hand an opportunity that you might be more inclined to drive change. On the other hand, sort of a concern or a worry about your budget or your resources that might make you less risk prone. So in summary, I think going forward, what we really need to think about is what is it going to take to do policy making in these times? I think we're going to need to balance agility and accountability, which is something I can talk about more. I think we need to be able to be willing and able to take risks in order to drive transformative change. We're going to need a whole new different type of leadership. And we should be somehow hopefully able to capitalize on this current crisis, which in some ways is an opportunity. And my final point is that uncertainty is not at all the same as inability to know or inability to prepare. So maybe I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Darius, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Danny. So I really like the way Sylvia laid out the problems that we're confronting in terms of increased uncertainty. And I want to focus on the need for risk-taking and radical new ideas in particular. So I think Sylvia's identified some really big problems, and And there's a temptation as policymakers to respond to that with big, high-profile, well-resourced agencies. And I think I want to make 2 points. And the first thing I want to do is kind of push back against that. In research that I've done with Danny on innovation agencies, we find that tackling big problems with big agencies can actually make things worse, especially if your goal is to improve risk-taking and the diversity of ideas. And basically the issue there is by raising the profile of the agency and putting a spotlight on the agency, you're placing tremendous pressure on bureaucrats not to make mistakes. You can actually increase risk aversion, less willing to take chances, make conservative bets, copy others, which is exactly the opposite of what you would want if you want to create a culture of risk-taking. And it can also be a magnet for special interests, right? So when Danny and I look at social transformation in Finland and Israel, and more specifically their transformation into innovation leaders, which they were not at all 2 decades ago, we find that the new ideas that came out of the public sector originated not in the glamorous high-profile agencies, but at the periphery of the public sector, in what we call Schumpeterian developmental agencies, although I think we'd both agree we should have called them Batman agencies, because I think that's a more intuitive metaphor. These are small, modest agencies that operate anonymously in the middle of the night, live in a cave. In the case of Finland, you'd think I'm joking, but Sitra, the agency responsible for piloting R&D grants and venture capital funding, which became the core of the Finnish innovation policy. It was literally situated in the basement of the Bank of Finland. I don't think the Bank of Finland even knew it was there. If they did, they certainly didn't care about it. And combined with the modest endowment, which was crucial, that gave the foundation incredible flexibility in terms of experimenting with new policies, which were radically innovative in Finland and controversial at the time. And actually, the interesting thing is, as Sitra got credit for its successes, it became less flexible over time precisely because of the increased political scrutiny and public pressure. So, in terms of tackling big problems, and to the extent that we need risk-taking and radically new ideas, I would encourage people to think small rather than big and look to the periphery of the public sector. The problem with that, of course, is that that's nowhere near the scale that you need to tackle the types of huge problems and create the social transformations that that Sylvia, I think, quite correctly is talking about. And there, I actually want to shift the analysis away from innovation agencies, because I think it's a very tall order to ask an innovation agency to do that sort of thing, and instead look at the Nordic countries as a whole. This is my second strand of research, is focusing on the Nordic countries as really models of social transformation because of the way they've reinvented themselves over time. So I document their shift from resource extraction to heavy industry to knowledge-intensive services, and then the radical policy changes that accompanied that. And I document that, and I try and explain that. And I think in terms of explaining broader level social transformation, what's really driving this story is not innovation agencies per se, although the Nordic countries have some fine ones, but rather the institutional and social structure in which they're embedded. And in particular, I focus on the role of tight-knit networks and consensual politics, which we often think of as delaying change. I see it as an agent of change, and in particular, enabling these societies to experiment with new ideas at scale. And there are a variety of different mechanisms by which that takes place. So I talk about persuasion, compensation, and coordination. But I want to wrap up by focusing on just one, which is the politics of compensation, since I have limited time. And in particular, the development of risk-sharing and compensatory institutions that compensate the losers of change, and in so doing, reduce social resistance to change and new ideas, whether it comes from a Batman-style public sector agencies or the private sector or community organizations. And of course, the big one there is the welfare state in the Nordic countries, which as North Americans, we often think of delaying change. But I think in the Nordic countries is widely recognized as delivering the political and social stability to enable more radical and rapid changes in other areas. So to provide just two examples of that, in the economic sphere in the Nordic region as a whole, the welfare state underpins broad support for free trade and the disruptive effects that follow from that are constantly reshaping Nordic societies and Nordic economies. To focus on just one country and a more specific example and talk about policy, recently I've been looking at Denmark and the early adoption of a lockdown in response to the COVID pandemic, which was an incredibly risky choice at the time to be early with that, risky politically and economically. And there I would point out how that was tied to social protections for workers, but also the rapid extension of those protections to employers through the temporary wage compensation program, with the result that industry and labor not only tolerated the lockdown, but actively endorsed it, right? So if we want radical new ideas from our innovation agencies, I'd encourage us to think small. If we want to scale them at a societal level, I think that's a big burden for any one agency to bear. And there I'd think about broader institutional structures that might reduce resistance to both economic change and policy reform. So happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. Let me conclude by thanking Danny for moderating and the other panelists for joining this conversation.
Thank you, Darius. The floor is now Uri's.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you for inviting me. Look, I think it's a very challenging period of time in more than one way. And when we say uncertainty, I mean, there is uncertainty on what's going to happen. Obviously, nobody knows how this pandemic will play out. But when we talk about the innovation ecosystem, specifically when I know more about the Israeli one, and it's a startup-driven ecosystem, there's an uncertainty of what's going on now. Okay, so if you ask me, has the innovation ecosystem in Israel been hit very hard by the pandemic? The data so far doesn't show it. Okay, now we really, honestly, we don't know, and I sit on the data daily. Okay, we honestly don't know if we were basically seeing the momentum of 6 months ago and saying, okay, due diligence take time, and we're in a place that that we're just seeing the momentum, or they all switch to Zoom and investments go on in a different way, but things are roughly okay. We honestly don't know the answer to that. We also don't know right now if VCs are underfunded and we'll see the results in 6, 12, 18 months. So that, I think we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of uncertainty on the future and on the present, and this affects obviously how innovation agencies react. Okay, do they say I'm waiting to see if there's a problem, or are assuming there's a problem and taking precautions anyhow? But I want to address now 3 levels, 3 tiers of what I think needed from innovation policy, and I think Darius made a brilliant point about if this at some point goes beyond the realm of an innovation agency, and I'm going to come back to that. But going very briefly, the 3 levels. First is what I started with, is being counter-cyclical. Okay, there is a fear or maybe the reality of investments going down. You have to counter that with government money and to say, guys, you're a startup, your runway is 3 months. I'm going to extend it to 9 months. And I think that's extremely important because, again, specifically in a startup-driven ecosystem, you can lose, 300 startups in 6 months to 300, good startups You won't feel this in the economic data. It will, be swollen in the entire economic turmoil. You will feel it 2-3 years from now when you won't have, big companies or emerging companies. You will feel that you lost the seeds of 3 years ago, and that's extremely troubling scenario. And I think we must be active in maintaining that. I think that's more of the obvious. The second tier is that, and I'm going back to what Sylvia said, is that it opens opportunities. Okay, the crisis opens opportunities, and there are some fundamental issues, really from the infrastructure. You can look in the ecosystem and say, okay, now that I'm in lockdown, in pandemic mode, okay, what can I fix in the ecosystem? And just making, the lemonade out of those lemons. And for instance, in Israel, the fact that there are not a lot of investors coming in right now, practically zero, took the Israeli Innovation Authority to persuade or to incentivize Israeli institutional investors to say, guys, you were out of the game for years, out of the high-tech game. Now it's a good time to link with the high-tech ecosystem. So far, it was so crowded. I mean, the American investors, European investors, Chinese investors were there. You didn't really feel the need or the opportunity there, or the the profit-making opportunity. And now that's the time. That's one example. Another example is for Israeli high-tech startups to start looking at Israel as a beta site. Okay, to start looking at Israel as a beta site. So far, they thought about, okay, my first client should be in the US or in Europe, because otherwise, it doesn't count for anything. All of a sudden, so what? That's or the Israeli government, or the Israeli railway station, railway company, or the electricity company. All of a sudden, that's an opportunity. Third tier, which I think is the most crucial one. This pandemic is not going to go away quietly, and it's going to cause havoc, across society. We're already seeing this, this K-type recovery, where high-tech companies more or less will do well. They can work safely from their homes, even from remote working. They can work safely from home, and they can interact with their clients mostly if it's software based, mostly, and it's obviously it's affecting them, but it could be a lot less damage. And there's a lot more opportunities out there, because everybody's looking now for tech. We're in an era that moving biological bodies is dangerous. Moving bits is cheap, it's efficient, it's safe. That's definitely something that will increase the demand for technology, and we'll have to deal, I think, during the pandemic, but for sure after the pandemic, with the digital divide. Which will I think increase dramatically. It's no longer how much your salary of the high-tech engineer vis-a-vis someone is not in high-tech. It's the safety, the health risk of going into work that you have to be physical presence versus working comfortably from your house. I think this will drive a lot of tension, and I think here technology can also be the solution to many of those problems. Maybe we'll touch on that later, but I see my 7 minutes are up. So definitely, challenging time, both from just straightforward counter-cyclical, challenging, fundamental changes, even more challenging, and dealing with the societal problem. And I totally agree with Darius. This is more than just an innovation agency. You have to have a functioning political system, and I'll end with that.
Thank you so much for all of you. Now I'll take the power of a moderator to have a few comments and ask you a first question. So the one thing I obviously believe in every word Darius said, because we wrote those papers together. So by definition. However, one thing that I have not heard any of you talk about is one of the things that we said, and I talked also with Uriah and less with Sylvia about it. When you are faced with uncertainty and constant uncertainty, you act, correct, but the way you act is actually by experimenting. And as you experiment, you try things, a lot of things, preferably rapidly, but then you also have to make a decision of what to kill and what to scale up. I have heard up until now, not just from you, but from anyone, how do you decide what to kill? How do you decide what to scale up? I heard one thing here about scaling up, which is, I'm sorry, not very helpful if I'm not the Nordic countries, and that is to historically have a good set of institutions. I would also say, as a Canadian, that we actually have wonderful set of institutions and a very consensual, don't rock the boat kind of, I don't know how to call it, political culture. And yet, I haven't seen any transformation of Canadian economy since Canada decided to be a country, even when it might be worthwhile. Which makes me very worried, not about the pandemic. The pandemic, I think this is excellent. But what happens after the pandemic? If indeed, especially if we have what Uri, and we already had one question about it, K kind of recovery, which is growing inequality. And I think it's not just growing inequality, which is a problem by itself, but a growing mobility issue. Meaning that if you were born now in a place where the internet is just not good enough, you will not have school for 3 years. And I don't need to tell you what happens 10 years later. So I would like to hear from all of you a little bit more about experimentation, a little bit more about scale up, a little bit more of what happens if we have a real K. So not just inequality, but the inability of people just because they're unlucky of where they are or any other reason to go up in society and contribute to society. And I'll leave my other question later, depending on how many we have from other people. Whoever wants to answer those sets first is welcome.
I'll have a go with the experimentation. I think experimentation at this stage, that's the right timing. Okay, that's the right timing. We don't know too much, okay, what's going on. We don't know what will happen in the future. If there is ever time to experiment, and to lay some big bets, now is the time. There is a shift that we all see from the business sector to governments. Governments are taking the lead, okay? Governments are spending a lot of money. If you're spending a lot of money, at least try to experiment with this. Try to jumpstart the economy with some new ideas. Danny knows better than me about 1985, probably the worst economic crisis in the history of Israel. Out of this came the office of the chief scientist. Okay, it was born a decade before, but it really came into with legislation and with budgets 1985, and it's not a coincidence. Out of the crisis, all of a sudden you say, okay, let's start rolling this dice with some investment in innovation. I know for a fact that the Israel Innovation Authority, which is the continuum of the office of the chief scientist, for 40 years said we only care about R&D investments. All of a sudden was faced with, okay, there are startups that are going bankrupt in 3 months. And their initial reaction was, okay, but I don't see an R&D, they're not submitting any R&D project. And I was yelling at the phone. I said, guys, I was part of, the creation of the Innovation Authority exactly for that, for these kind of moments. Said the heck with R&D projects now. Okay, just these guys need a lifeline. This is the time to nobody's now is going to criticize you if you're going 100% according to the rules. Just get the economy going. And I think the Innovation Authority, the Israel Innovation Authority, was extremely efficient in that, in just opening all the drawers and say, okay, let's try all these plans. I'm going back to Darius' point. This cannot stop there. Okay, I'm a bit embarrassed to sit here as an Israeli and say, in a startup nation with 3,000 startups, 600, 700 startups a year, from May to September, everybody knew that the education system will open in September in some kind of a lockdown, and there is absolutely zero experimentation in online teaching, online learning. Everybody's sitting with a Zoom, trying to have a 4-year-old kid trying to be in the kindergarten through. It's just embarrassing, okay? The ability, if the government was in sync here with the Innovation Authority, Ministry of Education says, guys, we cannot have these kids lose now a year or a year and a half of school. We're the startup nation, for God's sake, okay? Let's have 50 startups have a go with this. They don't have anything else to do, okay? Let's just throw money at them, let them experiment. This is the kind of leadership that I'm as a civilian, I'm demanding from my government, and I'm embarrassed to say that we don't see this, okay? The government is now, occupied with other unfortunate things, but I think this is the time that technology can be, not just the source of inequality, but a solver of problems. We solve problems through technology. This is why technology is there. It's not just to make fancier phones, iPhones, and better cameras that you can detect the difference between this generation, that generation. It's to actually solve day-to-day problems, and we don't see this. And I think this is, from a innovation point of view, an embarrassing moment. And there should be some soul searching in innovation and science too, to say, how come that 6 months into this crisis, we're still not coming up with good solutions? I'll hand you here.
Okay, so I'll add a twist to that, because we started to talk about the distribution of money. And this is also for Darius and Sylvia. As we all know, in politics, the people who tend to get the money and the help in time of crisis are the people with best connections, speaking about networks, and also pay the best lobbyists. How do small businesses, especially since by definition a lot of the innovators are startups or new, so they don't have, unless you Google, you don't have those networks. What is the politics of distribution or compensation, as Darius said, in times of crisis, not just for citizens, but making sure that the economy still survives?
Go ahead, Darius. Yeah.
Yeah, let me think about that. I mean, I think part of the strength of the SDA, or the Batman-style innovation agency, is really trying to reduce the profile. So in the case of Finland, Sutra was able to work with the tech sector, which at the time were the marginal small businesses of the Finnish economy, and the big boys, as it were, in pulp and paper and heavy metal and so on and so forth, basically didn't pay attention to it. So that's one kind of solution. I did want to get back at your original question, Danny, which is really a two-parter. in terms of Canada learning from the Nordic countries, there's like a lot to say about that. On the social policy front, I think there's a lot of stuff where Canada is could do better in terms of, you mentioned broadband access, childcare, continuing education, and I would focus on that. That's actually not so much an issue of uncertainty and not understanding what best practice is in the area. It's more a question of politics and the dynamics of political reform. Let me set that to the side and get the second half of your two-parter, which was the killing of projects. Of course, Danny, you're not going to be surprised to know that Batman is not only great at creating new things, but killing things as well. In the case of these agencies, because like Citra was so small, one of the problems it had was that every time it had a success and came up with a brilliant new policy, someone stole it, which actually turned out to be a good thing because it forced Citra back to the drawing board to come up with new ones. At a macro level, I'd emphasize the role of economic openness and international openness in the Nordic countries as a disciplinary device that basically forces them to be cold and relentless, especially in economic policy and economic projects. To what extent that generalizes to health or climate is an open question, but that would be one way in which to kill experiments that aren't working.
So if I can add just also briefly, I think a lot of important points have been made. Your point, Dan, about experimentation, that experimentation is happening by definition, I would completely agree. But the problem is that the experimentation, it's happening not by design and not for transformation. The experimentation that's happening right now is sort of just plugging holes and protecting society in the immediate presence. And there's very little, I would argue, deliberate experimentation for transformation. As Uri said, seizing these opportunities, saying, let's take this moment and really invest in digitalization of higher education, take some risks. There would be a huge buy-in, I think, from society for that right now. So the problem with experimentation is it's not happening, as I said, by design or for transformation. I also think that the problem, you already mentioned that right now it's government taking over from the private sector, but we have this other tendency, which is that the nation state level is also taking over from other levels, right, as a result of COVID, because we're shutting borders, and health is a national issue. It's not an internet, it's not a EU issue, for example, it's a national issue. So, and this to me is also problematic because from my experience with the Nordic countries, the national level has not always been the best at driving transformation. You see a lot of transformation happening at city level, and then you see a lot of responsibility for transformation that needs to be handled at perhaps EU or supranational level, whereas the national level tends to be actually, in my mind, quite bad at driving transformation. And it's for the reasons that you mentioned, Darius, that we think that we solve our problems by creating an innovation agency, which is really the very wrong way to go about it. We need a lot more horizontal policy making. We need a lot more resource fluidity, which we don't see, that you can quickly allocate money to different policy areas. And then I'm just going to finish with what I think is happening right now, to your point, Danny, about who's getting the support, how is the money being allocated? What I see, unfortunately, is that we're throwing a lot of money right now in the Nordic countries at higher education institutions and at healthcare. Right? And that is, in a way, it could be a really good thing if it comes with a clear mandate to really drive change, but that's not necessarily happening, right? We're throwing money at healthcare, which already has problems. We needed fundamentally different healthcare, and we're throwing money at higher education, which has been struggling with digitalization or transformation for decades. And by throwing money at them, we're not at all guaranteeing that they're going to drive change. On the contrary. So that is my sort of concern.
Which leads me to another question, set of questions that we had, and that is there's one uncertainty which we have not talked about, and especially how it relates, of course, to, let's call it, innovation policy, the innovation sector, whichever one. One uncertainty, that uncertainty is this is a long-term situation, the new normal. That's we don't know. So for how many more years are we going to do everything by Zoom? And then there's a second uncertainty. And okay, let's assume this pandemic sort of dies down. What are the changes that are going to stay with us? And how are we going to plan for that, right? What I would like to hear from each and every one of you is a few words about that, and whether in the countries you either deal with, as policymakers and advisors, or you research, have you seen anything, and even just a debate about those issues that anyone can learn from?
Maybe I'll start. I totally agree that this is something that is permanent, even after the pandemic waves will subside. There is a switch to, and that's my opinion, that we're switching to another equilibrium, where working. Let's start with the obvious. Remote working becomes second nature, and we were all fearful of that. I'm managing 6 or 7 teams, and I couldn't imagine a year ago that I can manage them from Zoom. Now it's just, I have a morning call with all my 6, 7 deputies, and everything's fine, and then it's just a routine. And I'm not saying that we'll work 100% from home, but I'm guessing there will be a lot more hybrid models, which I think can lead, like a snowball. It will lead to, for instance, the role of cities. We're seeing in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is, if you're not familiar with it, it's the Israeli metropolitan, the only Israeli metropolitan, and everybody's trying to get into Tel Aviv and live in Tel Aviv, and obviously real estate prices are going through the roof. All of a sudden, we're starting to see people saying, okay, everything is shut down. I'm working from far away. I can be 50 kilometers, 60 kilometers. In Israel terms, by the way, 60 kilometers, it's a lot, it's a distance. Okay, I know that in Canadian, you just move to the next neighborhood. In Israeli, you just move to the edge of the country. Okay, so, and all of a sudden, you don't have to be in the center. Okay, you can be far away. You can, raise the kids with a lot more area. And I think we're already seeing, businesses saying, hey, why am I paying so much money for real estate in the middle of the city, where I can, even in the future, be in some hybrid model that people live far away and they can work from a WeWork type of place near their place. So I think there are even some seemingly minor changes can have huge effects on the economy, how we live, how we commute. And I think this will probably be something that will be long lasting. And I'm going back, and I'll end with that because we already talked about it. I think digital divide will be a massive problem. This is not going away. This will, I think, if at all, pandemic just accelerated that. And that is something that is going to be dramatic, and we'll have to address that as a fact that it is not going away.
Thank you for being so cheerful about the digital divide. Darius and Sylvia, is there anything you want to predict about the uncertainties of the future?
So, I mean, do you want to go first, Sylvia?
I can just say very quickly, that was my last point. I think that from my initial statement, that uncertainty does not mean an inability to prepare or an inability to even know, like I think that, and that's what I think, this is, I think, the point you're making, Dan, which is like, how are we planning for change? All we can agree upon that I think this change is lasting, but the question is, that doesn't mean we have to be passive. And I think that's the point. Like right now, it's extremely important to try and understand, okay, what is unlikely to go away, and what are we going to do with it and about it, and how are we going to use that to actually shape the future that we want to shape? And I think there is a huge opportunity right now in this uncertainty and in this flux. But to come back to your question, and I don't really see government seizing this opportunity right now. And that's why in this EU expert group, I'm advising the EU Commission on the Green Deal, and that's why we were talking about, you know, you need to protect, and then you need to prepare, and then you need to transform. And the problem is right now, I think governments are extremely preoccupied with protecting, and that, you know, is not going to get us to the next level where we want to be. And then I think they're sort of like, what do we call it, easing their conscience by saying, okay, we're going to invest in, at least in the Nordic countries, a lot of investment in education and research and science and technology, because we're going to prepare, you know, we're going to invest in knowledge and education. But that in itself is also not going to drive the transformative change that we need. So that's my concern, is exactly as you said, that we're not really planning for change, and particularly not for the change that we want.
Darius, you were so patient.
I mean, I would broadly agree. I think there's steps in that direction by governments. There's encouraging language, but, you know, national governments in general move slowly. They're moving slowly in this case. I do think it is an opportunity, because at the moment, the cost constraint on these big kinds of investments is relaxed a little bit. People recognize the gravity of the situation and the need for big, bold, transformative change. In terms of exactly what's needed, on the one hand, it's hard for me to say, because I have no idea what things are going to look like post-pandemic, whether we'll return to normal or it'll be different, or how. I don't think anyone knows because of the uncertainty. You know, but there are policies that accelerate the redistribution of workers and capital, that make it easier for people to switch jobs, that are probably going to be helpful no matter what. So, you know, if you're in the United States, efforts to improve the portability of healthcare from job to job and state to state, continuing education, getting people the digital skills that they need in order to transition to remote work, not just churning out more, you know, BAs, you know, young, technologically savvy young people, and then digital infrastructure, right? Which probably isn't as high salience in the Nordic countries, because it's something that they've already addressed more or less effectively, but it's certainly an issue in Canada. And I'll just briefly, I just want to flag Sylvia's point about subnational innovation as another way of thinking about this. And if we're talking about where Canada can learn from the Nordic countries, I've been very interested and working on cities, precisely because I think the municipal level is one area where it is a little bit easier for a large federal country like Canada or the US to replicate that Nordic style networking and cooperation. And there, of course, there are all sorts of opportunities for small and medium-sized cities with remote work, provided that they have the digital infrastructure to capitalize on that.
Excellent. I feel so much more relieved knowing that no one is even planning for the future in any of the countries we are talking with. I can also relate that I haven't seen that much done in Canada. I mean, people go, and that's the last question that I would like to ask you from me. And again, by the way, our audience, if you want to send a question, use Zoom Q&A, and it will get to us. Don't worry. But my last question is this behavior of government. So what I've seen in governments, and by the way, I've seen it in also the subnational government. So Ontario, for example, where this webinar happened, supposedly, even though you're from Israel and Sweden. When faced with this uncertainty, what they do is they go back to the basics. So higher education, health, protect, and then like a real visionary is always, somehow always, in each and every crisis, it's called infrastructure. I am wondering, and I would love to hear your advice, since we all know that this is not enough, since we all know that the future will be different, how do you entice policymakers? Forget politicians, they need to be re-elected, but how do you entice your best policymakers to start planning for the future, to start moving out of this comfort zone of infrastructure, education, and health? And I think I would love to hear Darius, but I would especially love to hear Sylvia and Uri about it, because I know they have scars from those kinds of fights.
Do you want to
So,
start,
Sylvia?
Uri? Yeah, or should I start?
Yeah, you start. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, I think this is like the big question, Dan. And I think one of my conclusions from all this years of trying to understand precisely this question, I would like to point out two things. One is I think is leadership at all levels, because I've been trying to, like, for example, drive change at one of the largest research universities in Sweden, and doing at the government level. And one of the things I realize is that I think you cannot underestimate leadership at all levels, and how leadership encourages responsibility and risk taking. The other one I would also like to point out is education. One of the things that I find is a problem in the Nordic countries is that people tend to specialize very early. And then they go into the government, or they go into industry, and they become lawyers. And it means that they're very quickly, all too quickly, they get stuck in their own sort of bubble of reality perception. So they have a tendency to view things very much through that lens. And since they don't necessarily move around a lot, and they've been educated already in a silo, which is the case actually in Sweden, that you specialize very early, I think they lack this sort of agile also thinking, to be able to understand and approach problems from different perspectives. And I think that is a problem, is that you approach a very complex issue from a sort of monodimensional or monodisciplinary perspective, and that is really right now hampering decision making, combined with a sort of lack of collective courage. And then maybe just to tie it up, which Darius mentioned, the role of trust. I really think that we should be utilizing our trust base a lot more consciously and proactively to take risks and to drive this kind of change that you're talking about, Danny. And the question is how we can get policymakers to do that. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Pain, maybe, prick them with pins until they do something.
Yes.
Uri, do you have
Yeah, I'll just a short remark. Look, I think it's important to structure innovation agencies with a mixture of people from within government, within the public sector, and with people from the industry. When we started the Innovation Authority, we insisted that we'll get, the leader will be someone who comes from the industry. We got Aaron, an unforgettable name, and he was before that the CEO of the R&D Center of Apple in Israel. And in regular times, you say, okay, maybe it doesn't make a difference if he comes from industry or everything is normal. I think in the last 6 months, you've seen someone who was under, and I'm not saying that civil servants, I was civil servant most of my career, that we can't handle pressure, but I think that coming from the industry and understanding what it is to be in, what is the high tech in this situation, allowed the Innovation Authority in Israel to react very, very quickly and efficiently and to be experimental. The trade-off there is that, if you want to lead now collaboration within government entities to talk with the Ministry of Education, etc., that's where coming from industry is not serving you, and you need someone who understands how to manipulate the political system. So definitely a trade-off, but getting the right mixture and the right leaders in advance for in crisis time to react quickly. I think it's essential.
So Darius, be quick, because then I want to insert 2 last questions before we have to finish.
Yeah, so very briefly, I mean, one other tip at all levels would be framing effects. And to an extent, Sylvia already did this, opened up the panel in this way. Innovation is usually framed as creating growth and creating jobs, which I actually think is counterproductive and often disappoints because it's so risky and prone to failure. I would instead frame it as averting catastrophe and underscore the magnitude of the challenges that we're facing. You know, terrify your superiors, write terrifying op-eds. And when people face a loss frame, when they're facing the prospect of losses, they tend to be more willing to take risks and make bold choices. So that's another way of approaching it.
Okay. So the last two questions that I would be delighted to hear something about relates to one horrible, or maybe not horrible crisis, but one of the other things that happens with pandemic and is happening more quickly with the pandemic is the uncertainty about the global system. And we are the Munk School of Global Affairs. And especially what seems to be more and more probable, and that is that especially innovation and science, technology and education and whatever you want, we will go back to a bipolar world, including in the production of stuff. So you'll have two sets of standards, two sets of everything. Companies that might want to work and sell in China will find it, or collaborate with Chinese companies will find difficulty working in the US, and the other way around. What, if at all, do you think the policymakers, especially innovation policymakers, have been even thinking about this, and how have been doing it, since we all come from, you know, minor countries, some two very small and one minor northern friend of the US. And the second is, and that has to do with the labor market. So instead of asking you like massive question of how we can restructure the labor market, let me ask you a very simple question. Because of a pandemic, you can now hire to your agencies the best people possible, people that will never even think about a career in innovation agencies. What kind of people would you hire? What are the skills that you, and therefore maybe the new economy, is looking for? And I'll stop here. You each have a minute and a half to answer all those questions. So Sylvia, how about you start, Uri, and then Darius, and then we say goodbye.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sure I can't answer both of those satisfactorily, but I think that one of the things that strikes me is that this is what I was talking about complexity, is that science policy, innovation policy no longer acts in a vacuum, if it ever did. And I don't think there's enough awareness about exactly what you're mentioning, Dan, that we're dealing with a serious geopolitical environment with large ramifications. And what I find also at universities is that actually researchers are not aware of that either. So, you know, there's still this kind of view that, you know, I can pursue my little project on a very high-tech, engineering or physics issue, and I can do that in the global enterprise of science, and it's neither my responsibility nor is it in my interest to sort of put that in a greater geopolitical context. Unfortunately, I think those days are over. But I would also want to make the point that I think our jobs in Canada, in the Nordic countries, is to fight for the openness of this international and global enterprise of science, and to make sure that we cannot no longer take it for granted. And we actually need to also step up here and figure out how we can counteract the tendencies that we see. And it's going to require a lot from us. So that's my first point. The other question, what kind of skills I'd like to see? I think I'd like to see, I like your framing idea, Darius, you know, like framing it more in terms of, you know, this resilience idea. Like if we want to maintain our societies and our values, we're going to have to do something radically different. And I think that therefore we need more disruptors in our agencies, like serious disruptors. We need to build in conflict. The problem with the Nordic society is that we tend to rely a little bit too much on consensus and not really embrace conflict, which I think is also a very good, productive, creative force.
Excellent. Uri?
I don't really know how to answer the first question, just, you know, saying that I hope that some sanity, the world will get back some sanity, hopefully sooner than later. In the case of Israel, you know, it's just the metaphor we always use, you know, is a very, very small boat between, two giant oceans being, the US and China. You're just trying to maneuver and not antagonize any of them. Going to your latter question of who would you hire to do innovation agencies, I think there is something that should be emphasized any day, but specifically in crisis time, and I don't think it's emphasized enough. Innovation policy is a profession. Okay, it is not anyone that knows how to do a good R&D or work in a startup or work in a global. I mean, can lead the organization, but we have to understand that this is a profession. This is a serious business. Okay, you can't come and just throw out stuff. You need experienced people. As I said before, you need the right mixture of people that come from here and there. But policy is a serious business. If you haven't spent 10 years of your life, 15 years of your life learning policy, implementing policy, understanding, learning from other agencies, other case studies, the chance that all of a sudden in the middle of a global pandemic you get everything right. I'm not saying that if you are experienced you'll get everything right, but you have much more chance of coming up with right policies.
Okay, that's a cheerful note for all our students who are just graduating from school. Thank you, Uri. Darius?
Yeah, just 3 quick concluding points. So in theory, I would say small countries should look at diversifying trade. In Canada, that's probably not going to happen because you're fighting geography, which is extremely powerful, and more importantly, the US, which you don't want to piss off. So my second point would be the importance of being flexible internally, and that comes back to issues of flexible internal labor markets, continuing education, lowering trade barriers within Canada, so on and so forth, so you can adapt to those kinds of shifts. In terms of who I would hire to manage that or those disruptive changes more generally, I'd emphasize the experience working in interdisciplinary groups in particular. It's one of the things I love about the Munk School, and I promise I wasn't planning on ending our discussion in this way, but I love the fact that it's not just that the syllabi and the instruction is interdisciplinary, but you get to see the students working across disciplinary silos, and I think that's really important if you want to wed the technological solutions that Uri has been talking about in terms of education with the actual practice of education, the experience of students, of teachers, and so on and so forth. So,
well, I want to, at this moment, because I think it's exactly 11:30, and Darius, strangely enough, was the most optimistic of you all, especially for the young people in the crowd. So I want to thank all of you. It was a wonderful discussion. I also want to thank the Munk School for allowing this to happen and supporting us. And of course, each and every of the people who joined the seminar from, if I understand correctly, 5 continents. So we're truly global. And I hope to see the four of us face to face soon, with some more certainty and some less uncertainty. Thank you so much and goodbye.